To welcome Rev.JESSE L, one of the America's foremost civil rights, religious and political figures. For the 40 years has played a very pivotal role in terms of virtual in every movement of empowerment, promoting peace, civil rights, gender equality, economic and social justice, and is also minister in Baptist Church. Promoted two major coalitions. One is the Operation Push, that is the People's United to Serve Humanity. Later it was merged with and became the Rainbow Push Coalition.
Drawing parallel between the African American movement in the US and the Dalit movement in India will be of great value to us. The Indian story is, one hand we have a constitution that is to set a just social order. On the other, we have widespread caste-based discrimination.
Who is the noble leader of the Dalit movements and also a great leader across the world who led the struggles of the Dalits and other with this process. I request Dr. Jesse Jackson to garland the photograph of the Dr. Baba Sahib.
There has been an interaction between the African American and the untouchable, former untouchable in India, because their problems are similar. Both face discrimination, one on the basis of race and color, the other on the basis of social ideology. The deprivation and marginalization is exactly similar. There are not much differences. Now, Ambedkar has written quite extensively on comparing untouchability and slavery in several of his writing. There are essays where he compared social justice philanthropy in USA and in India, and huge comparison between the African American and Dalit.
Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. In so many ways, this rather historic meeting tonight is a kind of fullness of time after so many years of being apart and disconnected, separate. Now we have a bigger mission in surviving, that's learning to live together. So much of our separation was intentional. You mentioned Dr. Du Bois and others who sought to have these Pan-Africanist meetings. Many years ago, it was difficult to have those meetings connected. People in the diaspora, whether they were from the US, Canada, Britain, or Europe, here with the quote-unquote untouchables in this country. We never got a chance really to know each other. But today's technology, that need not be the case any longer. I want to thank Mr. Mukherjee, who invited me here to be a part of a session of focus on children's literacy and children's poverty. We spent this week 3 days in Calcutta, cutting across a large swath of territory, meeting with religious leaders and political leaders and students and the red light district in the rural areas, a whole range of things. I went in a very special host. Please stand, Mr. Mukherjee. Give him a hand. Put your hand together. In my preparation to come, I was anxious to meet with Brother Paul. Met with Paul on yesterday in Calcutta, and we expect to have follow-up meetings. I'm as anxious as anything tonight for us to form some kind of commission tonight related to a comparable one on the state side, so we can begin to meet and exchange elementary information about what we are doing. It took a long time to revive the African American connection, because that separation was rather deliberate. And we were fed propaganda that made us look at each other with a sense of distance and a sense of shame. You would see a Tarzan movie with the white supremacist French figures and the Africans in such an inferior position. We'd go to the movement, we'd pull for Tarzan against Africans, pull them against ourselves. We just didn't know it better until we grew up and learned better and had a higher consciousness. But for some, these struggles grew and developed over time. In 1896, after 246 years of slavery, and in 1865, we won that battle, salvaging the Union and ending slavery. But then we resorted to apartheid by 1896 as a matter of law again. And the 1896 law in the U.S. Became apartheid law in South Africa in 1948. While some students from South Africa were in the U.S. studying Yale, they heard about what was happening in the South, and they came to South and met with Booker Washington. They knew of some attempt to begin to educate us at a school called Tuskegee. Fort Hare in South Africa is in some sense an imitation of Tuskegee in Alabama, both academic and a practical institution. ANWA started around 1911. The next year, ANC was born. And we began to develop parallel histories. And so by 1946, Mr. Dubé, who was the president of ANC, the year that Mr. Mandela became a leader of the Youth Congress at that time, along with his co-partner. The African-American lady was the wife of Mr. Dubé. They kept building. And by 1957, we found ourselves together in Ghana, and Nkrumah became president. Dr. King's subsequent addresses mentioned South Africa, even when he got his Nobel Prize, about the impact of such an ugly system in the world today. We kept building consciousness, and so by the end, when I ran for president in 1984, I declared that one of our major sessions, South Africa, was a moral disgrace, and people with a great sense of joy. At that time, neither party would touch the ANC in South Africa because ANC was on the terrorist list. As a matter of fact, Mr. Mandela was on the terrorist list until the year 2005. We kept fighting, and every day for a year we went to jail. Every day for a year, highlighting the South African American kinship and Britain kinship. And finally, at the Congressional Black Caucus, about 40 African Americans in the Congress put forth on the floor a bill to declare sanctions against South Africa. And the bill passed by a voice vote. That was the beginning of the end of the apartheid as we knew it at that time. The next year, Mandela got out of jail, and in so many ways, the rest is history. That was a whole century of our learning how to put these pieces together and come together. As late as 1990, the U.S. administration was considered that Iran and South Africa were vital to their national security interests. They would never give up their trade route, and blacks would never control the trade route where any and Atlantic Oceans come together. Just learning how, in the meantime, we're learning precious little about our family in South America. There are, in fact, more Africans in South America, south of Texas, than there are in North America. African Latinos, African Mexicans, African Brazilians, more than half of Brazilian. Brazil is African. African Cubans, African Caribbeans, African Venezuelans, African Mexicans, separated by language and by a system designed to exploit our separation. Well, we're beginning to learn now kind of who that part of our family is. Well, we didn't have much. This is a long way. I left Chicago the other night, got here in 14 hours. It's a long way and no real ability to connect. And then as we got deeper into it, we began to know that there was a gun de facto in South Africa, and a gun de facto here, but there's also a factor here called the Ambector factor, which is just coming a part of our consciousness, who led the Untouchables movement here, helped to build the Constitution, But that's not part of our everyday conversation, or the role of Natasha Bose. We get gunned and sacrificed and marched to the sea, but not so much about the military wing of the Indian liberation struggle. We get Mr. Mandela, many of them in his elder years, but we don't see him as leading the military wing of ANC in that struggle. And so now you begin to pick into your language, Ambassador, you have in exile, you have the African leadership, and you have African leadership in the jail, but you have Mandela on the outside fighting. I'm saying all that to say that hooking up Dr. King and Mandela, hooking up Mbekta, hooking up Natasha Bose, it's taken some time. So in many ways, this meeting tonight is a kind of on-time meeting, and we're going to move fast and make up for lost time. We went through several stages of our struggle, and you should kind of put this down. First of all, we were in slavery for 246 years. We were in slavery longer than we have been free. Enslaved. And we didn't call it that, but we were the untouchables. Our humanity was untouchable. We were considered to be three-fifths of a human being by Constitution. Supreme Court ruled that blacks had no right, whites were bound to respect. After that 246 was over, in come legal segregation. I was arrested in 1960 trying to use a public library. We couldn't go to the public library. We were untouchable. We couldn't use the same toilet. We couldn't drink water from the same fountain. We couldn't sit in public parks. Black soldiers had to sit behind knots of POWs on American military bases. We were untouchable. We couldn't drive the buses. The bus that arrested Rosa Parks, we couldn't drive one of those buses. We couldn't touch those jobs. We could not be a part of the bank lending process. And so in the end, we finally used the Constitution, and that's an issue we'll get to, but a group of African American lawyers who were minorities but had majority vision. Say minorities. Say minorities. With majority vision. Say minorities with majority vision. Your vision can be bigger than your situation. And sometimes it may fall a lot of the minority to save the majority. If the house is on fire, saving your room is not enough. If the house is on fire, and if it falls you a lot to save the whole house just to save your room, then thank be to God for big vision. Moses was a minority with a majority vision. Mandela in the political sense was a minority with a majority vision. Dr. King was a minority with a majority vision. And in many ways, when I think about the role of Mbekta, you are a minority with a majority vision. But this term, some people, I don't believe in, I'm not going to fight with segregation, I'm against apartheid. The difference between segregation and apartheid is the same thing. That's like wanting an egg with an omelet without an egg. Say amen. Amen. I mean, my point, we're even learning language. I mean, for a long time, there's something in India they call untouchables. And when they walk down the street, they get to get off the street and let the other people come by. We've been through the same phase. It's just a different language. Segregation. When I went to South Africa in 1979, they had pass books down after 10 o'clock at night. They couldn't go to the movie. They couldn't vote. They were in the margins. You're really talking about this issue of marginalization and how does one overcome it and fight marginalization. Well, in these last few years, here's India. We've overcome the external occupation of Britain. America overcome the external occupation of Britain. And then we then had to fight the internal occupation of America that fought against occupation from Britain. And once we got free, we found ourselves today we're free but not equal. India is number one in high tech, number one in billionaires, number one in poverty in the world, number 2 in auto production, and still has not addressed in a meaningful way the issue of the so-called people who cannot be touched. And so that struggle continues, but at least you have a frame of reference. We have, in America, the Constitution gives us a frame of reference, and we've used it to the max. Next week, when I go back to the States, we'll be going across the Evan Venice Bridge for the 49th time. We just had the right to vote since 1965. But we speak of how old the American democracy is just 49 years old. It's just 49. You say you can't, slavery and democracy couldn't be reconciled. That was slaveocracy, that wasn't democracy. And then you had segregation. We couldn't vote, only whites could vote. That was whiteocracy. We've had democracy since 1965, and everybody could vote. Blacks could vote in 1965. But guess what? White women couldn't serve on juries. Guess what? 18-year-olds couldn't vote. Students on college campuses couldn't vote. Guess what? You could not vote bilingually. And so since 1965, we led the changes to a new majority. When I ran for president in 1984, I noticed I had far more popular votes than I had delegates. There's a system called winner take all. And what that meant was if I got 49% of the vote, the opposition got 50.1, they would get 100% of the vote. Winner take all, which is another barrier. So we challenged that by 1988 to proportion. So if I get 49%, I get that percentage of delegates, as opposed to winner take all. Because of that system, by 2008, when President Barack ran, Hillary Clinton barely won California, Texas, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Under winner take all, she would have been the winner. But because we democratized democracy, Barack was the winner. When we fight back, our capacity is not limited just to the size of our group, because our principles are bigger than our numbers. I say our principles are bigger than our numbers. And that's how we ended up breaking the barrier in 2008. And then they said, well, it's post-racial generation. No, we want to be post-racist, not post-racial. We want to be multiracial, many faces, many places, many different groups. But we're learning how to now cope with a coalition. The fact is no Democrat has got a majority of the white vote since 1964. So what President Barack won was not because so much of the old America changed, but a new America came on the scene. The post-1965 vote, where blacks could vote, and Latinos, and 18-year-olds, and Native Americans, and students, and bilingual, that group changed America. The other group is still fighting to hold us back. We're fighting a terrible backlash today that's undermining the growth of the country. I mean, it's a real backlash. President Barack won the election, then they said, you're not born here, where's your birth certificate? The birther movement, led by credible people. You're not a Christian. This is not your religion. It's a false pretense. You're born in, they switch your birth certificate in Hawaii. And so the movement to discredit him, that failed, but they kept trying. It's a fight right now to afford American health care. You would think that would be just a down the hill, win at your back. It's been a hard fight to expand health care for every American. But against those odds, with amazing dignity, he has done significant things. One being that the first year he came in under Bush, we lost 800,000 jobs. We've not had a net loss of jobs 1 month since he's been president. That has moved. We were trapped in a war in Iraq. It was irrational and immoral. We had no reason to violate international law going into Iraq. 100,000 Iraqis got killed, 6,000 Americans got killed in that war, for which there has been no apology because we are not a member of the World Court. But we're out of there technically now, coming out of Afghanistan technically now, it seems. More Americans have health care, more are working. Because against those odds, we keep leading a new majority, which you have the capacity to do because you have the moral authority. So we've globalized capital. I was way out in the country in Calcutta 2 days ago, way out, maybe 80 miles out in the country. And I saw kids on bicycles talking on their cell phones. which means that they can be in the middle of nowhere and on the iPod in real time be talking to the whole world. That's different than yesteryear. And Dr. King never saw a cell phone. Malcolm never saw a cell phone, not to mention an iPod. And so here we are tonight because we're getting closer and closer every day. And I want us to use this night. This is a historic night. We globalize capital, we globalize technology, we'll not globalize human rights. We'll not globalize workers' rights. We'll not globalize women's rights. We'll not globalize children's rights. We'll not globalize the environment. We'll not globalize anti-racism. And that becomes the unfinished business that we must all collectively be a part of. I'm also want to make this case that whatever burdens you're bearing, don't internalize it. So many people sometimes get overcome with the nature of our crisis, and they internalize racism. They internalize fear. And as opposed to resisting, they resent and become angry, but they do not resist and keep fighting. You must have a capacity that's bigger than your situation. Just because you're in the room full of fire, you don't have to swallow the smoke. We have something that we got freed externally from Britain, but internally, we're still facing less jobs. Am I right about that? Less jobs, less contracts, less education, less health care, less life expectancy. But that's a job that you need not fight alone. I would say, lastly, this issue about the untouchable. It strikes me that Jesus wasn't untouchable, you know. The night he was born, they put out a death warrant to kill all the firstborn babies. And Herod made that. He was a majority, representing the minority. And no religious leaders fought back to save those babies from dying. Couldn't have been a solid night, holy night, because too much genocide was taking place that night. He was born a minority. He was born a Jew of that religious lineage. He was born on a death warrant. He was born having to run to Egypt as a refugee with his life in his hand. And yet, from that minority status, from that marginalization, he overcame his untouchableness and began to mobilize the untouchables into a new mass movement. So what he did, he never did join the big temple crowd. They turned on him, the Sanhedrin. He never did join the Roman government. He kept fighting for those untouchables who were in the margins. And the last night of his life, he stayed in the quarantine shelter of Simon the leper. Simon was untouchable. He had a disease. He broke out in sores. Nobody wanted to touch him. The last night, he had the choice to stay wherever he chose to stay that night in the quarantine camp of Simon. In some sense, we must choose each other. No matter what scars or kilos we have on each other, that they put scars on us, and we look at each other kind of out the side of our eye because we don't know each other. But we're learning. Say, but we're learning. Say, but we're learning. But we're learning. And that's why a kind of commission should come out of this, where we get some scholars on both sides, some scholar activists, and begin who is Ambektar? Well, we don't know. We just don't know. Who is Natasha? We don't know. Who's Gandhi, the nonviolent guy? You know, who did great things, and people take pilgrimages here to see him, and he did a great work, there's no doubt about that. But we know about Mother Teresa, but not about Natasha. We know about Mother Teresa, but not about Ambektar. We're going to learn, because we can come together now. We can literally have a meeting right now with on live TV screens talking to each other across the water. That was not true 10 years ago, but it's true tonight. And I would say, lastly, is that in these struggles, don't be a short distance runner. Don't let them break your spirit. Don't turn on each other, and never stop fighting back. And we're going to find out that we have the capacity to change the whole world. No one would have thought when I first ran for president that even African American could be president of the United States. But we had superior candidates. And what we fight for now is The reason why you got to fight for the Constitution, we fight for equal protection under the law. Why do we do so well in football? I think you call it soccer here. Why do we do so well against all? Why do you have untouchables on that team? Why do we do so well? Repeat, say whenever. Repeat, whenever. The playing field. Whenever. The playing field is even. You can't inherit yards. You don't lose yards because you're not untouchable. You don't gain yards because you think you're superior. Whenever the playing field is even and the rules are public and the goals are clear and the referees are fair and the score is transparent, we can win. So we fight for an even playing field. We fight for an even playing field. And the scripture suggests that this fight is not just about piety. It's about justice. It's not about piety. The writer says this fight is not about flesh and blood. It's not about the pious things. It's about powers and principalities and wickedness in high places. You fight these wicked systems in high places, and you win sometime, you lose sometime. But you're judged not by the home run you hit at one inning or the drop ball in another, but by the box score. In the box score, we're winning. We're better off than we were. We're going to get better off still. We're not going to give up. We're not going to surrender. And when we fight up, we stand up and fight back, we win. The writer says, when you've done your best, you just stand. Just stand. Why do I keep getting back up? Because I know that there's nothing too hard for God. I also know that in addition to that when you're knocked down and you get back up again, don't stay down because the ground is no place for a champion. We're champions. We will come together. This night is a big night in our history, and we should build upon that for a bright future. Thank you very much.
Several decades ago, a very famous man, Martin Luther King, began his speech by saying, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." We, the Dalit movement, have a dream too. We envision an India of equality, secular and democratic India as set by the Constitution of India. We stand witness to the progress of the civil rights movement that was brought in America, a great change, and draw parallels with our own Dalit rights movement in India. We are humbled and strengthened by your words and continue to draw inspiration from your work. On behalf of the Indian Institute of Dalit Studies, Christian Aid and the National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights, we would like to express a heartfelt gratitude to you, and we hope that your experience in India has been as fulfilling as ours has been listening to your powerful words. We'd also like to thank Smita Narula, who's made this possible. We wish you and the Rainbow Push Coalition all the very best, and we hope that this is just a beginning for a much richer and longer collaboration. I end with the words of the great leader, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the architect of the Indian Constitution, who said that for a successful revolution, it is not enough that there is discontent, but what is required is a profound and thorough conviction of the justice, necessity and importance of political and social rights. So we hope that our struggle for social justice would continue. He also said we need to educate, we need to organize, and we need to agitate. And we as a Dalit movement, we'd also like to say that no distance, no number of miles, no geographical borders can stop us by building a solidarity between the African Americans and Dalits. And we have a capacity to change the world. Thank you so much. Jai Hind.